eyes open, skin intact, fingernails clean, no decay, no rot, no smell of death. 138 years buried in Arctic ice. John Torrington looked like he died yesterday. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. 129 men, 3 years of provisions, steam heating systems, the Royal Navy's finest, sent to map the Northwest Passage in 1845. None returned. Official record, lost with all hands. Classification, unsolved disappearance. Frost explains death. Starvation explains bones. Scurvy explains wounds. But what explains a face frozen in time, staring back from 1846? On May 19, 1845, 2 ships departed from Greenhithe, England. HMS Erebus carried Sir John Franklin, the expedition commander. HMS Terror carried Captain Francis Crozier, second in command. Both vessels had been reinforced for polar exploration. Iron plating covered the hulls. Steam engines powered internal heating systems. Retractable propellers allowed navigation through narrow ice channels. The Royal Navy called them unsinkable. The mission was simple: chart the final unexplored section of the Northwest Passage, connect the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Canadian Arctic, open a new trade route to Asia. Franklin had explored the Arctic twice before. He knew the ice. He knew the cold. He knew how men died in white silence. The crew numbered 134 at departure. 5 men were discharged in Greenland for medical reasons. 129 continued north. Officers wore wool uniforms with brass buttons. Sailors wore canvas trousers and cotton shirts. Every man carried a knife. Every officer carried a journal. The ships held 8,000 canned tins of meat, soup, and vegetables. Enough food for 3 years. In July 1845, whalers saw both ships moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay. The crews appeared healthy. Supplies remained untouched. Captain Dannett of the whaling ship Prince of Wales recorded the encounter in his log. Franklin told him they were waiting for favourable ice conditions. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Dannett sailed south. Franklin sailed west into Lancaster Sound. That was the last confirmed sighting by European eyes. Silence followed. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. No ships returned. No messages arrived. The Admiralty waited. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, did not. In 1848, she funded the first private search expedition. The Royal Navy followed with official rescue missions. Over the next decade, more than 30 expeditions searched the Arctic. They found nothing. Until 1850. Captain Horatio Austin's search squadron discovered 3 graves on Beechey Island. The island sat at the entrance to Wellington Channel, deep in the Arctic archipelago. 3 wooden markers stood in the permafrost. 3 names carved into crude crosses: John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain. All died in winter 1846, less than 8 months after Franklin entered the ice. The graves were small. The ground was frozen solid. Someone had dug through rock-hard earth to bury these men properly. Someone had built markers. Someone had held a service. That meant discipline still existed. That meant the expedition was functioning according to naval protocol when these men died. Austin's crew found no other evidence. No abandoned equipment. No discarded supplies. No written messages. The ships had been there, but they had moved on. The question became, where? In 1854, explorer John Ray met Inuit families near Pelly Bay. They carried silver spoons, buttons, and pieces of wood with Royal Navy markings. They told Ray a story. White men had been seen years earlier, dragging boats across the ice southwest of King William Island. The men looked sick. Their faces were black and swollen. Some had collapsed while walking. Some had been found dead in their tents, with no sign of violence. The Inuit said something else, something the British public refused to believe. They said they found bodies with marks, knife marks on bones, flesh removed from limbs, skulls cracked open. The British Parliament denounced Ray's report. Charles Dickens wrote essays defending Franklin's honour. The Royal Navy insisted the Inuit were lying or mistaken. Civilized men did not eat each other, but the Admiralty quietly reclassified the expedition from missing to lost, from lost to dead. In 1859, a final search party led by Captain Leopold McClintock discovered a cairn on King William Island. Inside the cairn was a metal cylinder. Inside the cylinder was a paper document. 2 messages written in different handwriting on the same page. The first message, dated May 28, 1847, reported normal conditions. Both ships wintering safely. All well. Signed by Graham Gore and Charles Desvaux, officers under Franklin's command. The second message, written in the margins 1 year later, told a different story. April 25, 1848. HMS Terror and HMS Erebus abandoned. Total loss by deaths, 9 officers and 15 men. Sir John Franklin died June 11, 1847. Captain Crozier assumed command. The remaining crew, 105 souls, would attempt to march south toward Back's Fish River. Signed by Crozier and Fitzjames. The handwriting was shaky, words crossed out, ink smeared. McClintock's report noted the writing appeared erratic, as if penned by someone exhausted or ill. The message answered one question: Franklin was dead, but it raised another. What killed 24 men in the first 2 winters, before the ships were even abandoned? McClintock found more. Scattered around King William Island were remnants of the march. A lifeboat mounted on a sledge filled with random objects: silver plates, silk handkerchiefs, a Bible, toothbrushes, chocolate. No cold weather clothing, no preserved food, just weight. Just useless luxury items dragged across frozen wilderness by dying men. Skeletons lay along the route, some clothed, some stripped, some scattered by animals. McClintock did not report what he saw on those bones. His journal described the findings as too disturbing for publication. The Franklin expedition became a legend, the greatest disaster in British naval exploration. But the bodies remained mysteries. Skeletons offered clues, but they could not show how the men truly died. They could not show what happened to their faces, their skin, their eyes. That required ice. In 1984, anthropologist Owen Beatty received permission to exhunt the 3 graves on Beechey Island. The graves were intact. The permafrost had kept them frozen for 138 years. Beatty's team used hand tools to chip through the ice coffins. They melted the final layer with warm water. When the first coffin opened, the crew stopped working. John Torrington lay exactly as he had been buried, blue kerchief around his head, shirt buttoned to the neck, hands folded across his chest. His skin was pale grey-blue. His lips were slightly parted. His eyelids were not fully closed. You could see his eyes beneath them, blue-grey eyes, staring upward, as if he had just fallen asleep, as if he could wake. No decomposition, no rot, no insect activity. 138 years in the grave. His fingernails were still attached. His hair was still rooted to his scalp. The only sign of death was the cold. Beatty's team performed autopsies on all 3 bodies. John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain. All showed signs of tuberculosis and pneumonia, expected diseases in Arctic conditions. But the tissue samples revealed something else. Something that explained the erratic handwriting on the Victory Point note. Something that explained why 105 men chose to abandon 2 reinforced ships and drag boats across 1,000 miles of ice. Lead. The bodies contained lead concentrations more than 10 times normal levels. Lead in the bone marrow, lead in the hair follicles, lead in the soft tissue. Enough lead to cause neurological damage. Enough lead to cause paranoia, confusion, and violent mood swings. Enough lead to make rational men make irrational decisions. The source was obvious once Beatty examined the food tins recovered from the wreck sites. The Royal Navy had contracted Stephen Goldner's canning company to provide provisions. Goldner used lead solder to seal the cans, thick beads of lead running along every seam. The solder leached into the food, every meal, every day, for 3 years. Laboratory tests on recovered cans showed contamination levels high enough to poison a man within months. The crew had been eating toxins from the moment they left England. The symptoms would have appeared gradually: fatigue, headaches, abdominal pain, confusion, aggression. By the time Crozier ordered the ships abandoned, the men were already dying from the inside. But lead poisoning alone does not explain what happened on King William Island. It does not explain the bones. In 1992, physical anthropologist Anne Keenlyside examined skeletal remains recovered from multiple sites along the expedition's final route. 92 bones from at least 13 individuals. Femurs, tibias, ribs, skulls. Every bone showed identical marks. Cut marks, made by metal blades, made by knives. The marks were systematic, evidence of peri-mortem defleshing, skeletal processing consistent with nutritional cannibalism, cuts along muscle attachment points, cuts around joints, cuts designed to separate flesh from bone efficiently. These were not defensive wounds. These were not accidental injuries. These were butchering marks, the kind made when processing meat. Keenlyside's report used clinical language: peri-mortem defleshing, post-mortem disarticulation, nutritional cannibalism. But the conclusion was clear. The crew of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had eaten their dead. The pattern suggested desperation, not ritual. Bodies were processed where they fell. No attempt to hide the evidence. No attempt to bury the bones properly. Just consumption. Just survival. The Inuit testimony from 1854 had been accurate. The British Parliament had been wrong. But why march at all? Why abandon 2 ships with steam heating and iron hulls? Crozier was an experienced Arctic officer. He knew the dangers of overland travel in polar conditions. He knew the survival rate for men on foot was nearly 0. So why give the order? The answer may lie in the ships themselves. When divers finally located HMS Erebus in 2014 and HMS Terror in 2016, both vessels were remarkably intact. Erebus sat upright on the seafloor south of King William Island. Terror rested in Terror Bay, exactly where Inuit oral history said it would be. The hulls showed no catastrophic damage, no fire, no explosion, no hull breach. The ships had simply been abandoned and left to drift until they sank. Inside Erebus, artifacts remained where the crew had left them. Plates stacked in the officers' mess, wine bottles in storage, navigation instruments secured in cabinets. Everything suggested an orderly evacuation, not a panicked flight. But one detail stood out in the archaeological reports. The lower decks were flooded, not from external damage. The flooding came from inside, from the steam heating system. The pipes had frozen and burst. Water accumulated in the holds, making the ships unstable. The pumps would have required constant operation, constant maintenance, constant labor. With a crew already weakened by lead poisoning, tuberculosis, and scurvy, maintaining the pumps would have become impossible. Crozier faced a choice: stay on sinking ships with poisoned food and dying men, or march toward a Hudson's Bay Company outpost 1,000 miles south. He chose to march. The decision was logical. The execution was doomed. The sledges found by McClintock weighed over 600 pounds each, loaded with lifeboats, supplies, and personal effects. Navy regulations required officers to maintain certain standards even in crisis: silver cutlery, dress uniforms, religious texts. But regulations written in London meant nothing on Arctic ice. Every pound of weight reduced the distance the men could travel. Every luxury item was a death sentence. The crew divided into groups. Some stayed near the ships initially, hoping for rescue. Others began the march immediately. A third group attempted to return to the ships after realizing the march was hopeless. Skeletal remains have been found pointing in all directions, some toward the ships, some toward the mainland, some lying in circles, suggesting the men collapsed while walking in groups. One skeleton, discovered in 1869 by American explorer Charles Francis Hall, wore the remains of a Navy steward's uniform. The Inuit who led Hall to the site said the man had been found in a tent, alone, with a loaded pistol in his hand. The pistol had not been fired. Hall took the skull back to America. It was later lost. The rest of the skeleton remained where it fell. Another skeleton, found near Erebus Bay, lay inside a lifeboat mounted on a sledge. The boat contained 8 pairs of boots, 4 silk handkerchiefs, 2 rolls of sheet lead, 5 pocket watches, all stopped at different times. The skeleton's femurs showed cut marks. Someone had processed this man's body. Someone had removed the muscle tissue. Someone had eaten him. The Royal Navy never publicly acknowledged the cannibalism evidence. Official inquiries focused on navigation errors and environmental factors. The Admiralty blamed bad luck, bad weather, bad ice. They did not blame Goldner's lead soldier. They did not blame the decision to march. They did not blame the system that sent 129 men into the Arctic with poisoned food and no contingency plan. In 1854, when John Ray first reported Inuit testimony about cannibalism, the British press attacked him personally. Charles Dickens published multiple articles defending Franklin's honor. Dickens argued that Inuit witnesses were unreliable, that savage people would naturally assume civilized men behaved savagely, that British officers would choose death over dishonor. 40 years later, when McClintock's bones were examined, the cut marks were explained as animal damage, post-mortem scavenging by foxes and polar bears. The explanation held until modern forensic analysis proved otherwise. Fox teeth leave different marks than steel blades. Bear claws create fractures, not clean cuts. The marks on Franklin expedition bones were made by humans, by knives, by men. The 3 bodies on Beechey Island never showed evidence of cannibalism. They died early. They died before the crisis. They were buried with ceremony and care. But the men who died later, the men who marched south, they received no graves, no markers, no prayers, just shallow snow cover and Arctic silence. Their bones were scattered across hundreds of miles. Their names were lost. Even today, most of the 129 crew members have never been identified. Francis Crozier, the second in command who assumed leadership after Franklin's death, was never found. His body has never been recovered. Inuit oral tradition says a group of white men, led by an officer they called Agluka, lived among them for several years before disappearing. Some historians believe Agluka was Crozier, others say it is myth. Either way, no European ever confirmed his fate. Sir John Franklin's body remains missing. The expedition leader, who died in June 1847, according to the Victory Point note, was presumably buried at sea or on land near the ships. But no grave has been discovered. No marker exists. The man who led the mission died first, before the worst horrors began. Perhaps that was mercy. The Victory Point note, the only written record left by the expedition, raises more questions than it answers. Why did the message written in May 1847 say all was well, when Franklin had already been dead for 2 weeks? Why did the second message, written in April 1848, report that 9 officers and 15 men had died, when the Beechey Island graves already accounted for 3 deaths? The math does not work. Either the note was incorrect, or there were other graves never found. The handwriting suggests the writer was in physical distress. The paper itself shows signs of having been folded and carried in wet conditions. Whoever wrote that message knew it might be the last evidence the expedition ever left behind. And it nearly was. For 169 years, the ships themselves remained lost. Searchers looked in the wrong locations. Maps were incomplete. Ice patterns changed. The Arctic kept its secrets. Then, in September 2014, a Parks Canada survey team using side-scan sonar detected a large object on the seafloor near the Adelaide Peninsula. The dimensions matched HMS Erebus. Divers descended in cold water gear. Visibility was poor. The water was dark. But the ship was there, intact, resting upright in 11 meters of water. The masts were gone. The rigging was gone. But the hull remained whole. No visible collision damage. No explosion marks. Just a ship that had been abandoned and left to sink slowly over months or years. The deck was covered in sediment. The hatches were open. Inside, the officers' cabins still contained furniture. Tables, chairs, bed frames, glass bottles lay scattered across the floor, unbroken. Ceramic plates remained stacked in storage. The ship had not capsized violently. It had settled gradually as water filled the lower compartments. In the engine room, the steam system showed signs of catastrophic failure. The boiler pipes had frozen solid. Ice expanded inside the metal, creating fractures. Water from the melted ice had pooled in the bilge. The pumps, designed to remove seawater, could not handle the volume. The crew would have needed to pump constantly, just to keep the ship stable. Records from earlier Arctic expeditions noted similar problems. Steam heating systems were new technology in the 1840s. Engineers designed them for coal-fired power plants and railway locomotives, not for ships trapped in sub-zero temperatures. The pipes lacked proper insulation. The valves froze. The pressure gauges failed. What worked in London became deadly in the Arctic. The decision to install steam heating had been praised before departure. Newspapers called it innovative. The Admiralty called it essential. But no one tested the system in actual polar conditions. No one considered what would happen if the ships remained stationary in ice for years. The heating system, designed to save lives, became one more failure point. 2 years later, in September 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation located HMS Terror in Terror Bay. The ship sat in 24 meters of water, deeper than Erebus but equally intact. The hull showed no damage. The anchors were still attached. Even some of the deck railings remained in place. Terror had been abandoned, drifted with the ice, and sank in almost perfect condition. Divers explored the interior with remotely operated vehicles. The officers' mess contained wine bottles with corks still sealed. The captain's cabin held navigation charts, still rolled and stored in their tubes. In the crew quarters, wooden sea chests remained bolted to the walls. Everything suggested the evacuation happened in stages. The crew took some supplies, left others, prioritized wrong. One cabin contained something unusual, a heavy wooden desk secured to the floor. The desk drawers were closed but not locked. Inside one drawer, divers found stacks of paper, documents, logs, letters, all waterlogged and fragile, but readable with proper preservation. The papers are still being analyzed. Some contain routine weather observations. Others describe crew illnesses. One mentions flooding in the lower decks. Another references repairs to the heating system that failed. None of the recovered documents explain why Crozier ordered the final evacuation when he did. The ships were damaged but still floating. The hulls were intact. The food stores, despite being contaminated, still existed. Even with lead poisoning and scurvy, staying on the ships offered better survival odds than marching 1,000 miles through Arctic wilderness. The most likely explanation is psychological, not logical. Lead poisoning causes cognitive impairment. Judgment fails. Paranoia increases. Men see threats where none exist. If Crozier and his officers were suffering from advanced lead toxicity, their decision-making would have been compromised. They may have believed the ships were about to sink when they were not. They may have believed rescue was closer than it was. They may have simply panicked. The sledges support this theory. The items loaded onto the sledges made no practical sense. One sledge carried 8 pairs of boots, but no preserved meat. Another carried heavy silver plates, but no extra clothing. A third carried religious texts and toothbrushes, but no medical supplies. These were not survival choices. These were the choices of men whose minds were failing. Inuit testimony, collected by multiple explorers between 1854 and 1869, describes the white men as confused and weak. One Inuk hunter told Charles Francis Hall that he encountered 4 sailors near Starvation Cove. The men were dragging a boat on a sledge. They gestured toward the south, indicating they were walking to a fort, but they were walking in circles. The hunter tried to explain they were going the wrong direction. The men did not understand. The hunter left them. He never saw them again. Another testimony, recorded by explorer Frederick Schwatka in 1879, described finding a tent containing 2 skeletons. The tent was properly erected. The men inside had apparently died in their sleep, but the tent contained no food, no fuel, no supplies beyond a few personal items. The men had stopped walking, set up camp, and simply waited to die. The Inuit who found the tent said it looked like the men had given up. This pattern of abandonment appears throughout the archaeological record. Men stopped where they stood, left supplies behind, made no effort to continue. Lead poisoning causes severe fatigue and depression in its final stages. Combined with starvation and hypothermia, the crew would have lost the will to move. They would have sat down in the snow and never stood up. The timeline of death can be roughly reconstructed from the evidence. Winter, 1845 to spring 1846. 3 men die and are buried on Beechey Island. Summer, 1846 to spring 1847. The ships remain trapped in ice. Franklin dies June 11th, 1847. Winter, 1847 to spring 1848. 21 more men die. April 25th, 1848. The ships are abandoned. 105 men begin the march. After that, the timeline becomes unclear. Some men died within days of leaving the ships. Others survived weeks or possibly months. A few may have lived into winter 1848 or even spring 1849. But none survived long enough to reach the Hudson's Bay Company outpost. None made it to safety. The march was a slow death sentence for every man who participated. The question remains, who made the decision to abandon the ships? Crozier commanded after Franklin died. But Crozier was an experienced Arctic officer. He had survived previous expeditions. He knew the dangers of overland travel. Yet he gave the order anyway. Why? One possibility is mutiny. If the crew, poisoned and desperate, refused to stay on the ships, Crozier may have had no choice but to lead them. Naval discipline required officers to maintain control. If maintaining control meant marching to certain death, then that was the order. The alternative was chaos, mutiny, violence, officers killed by their own men. Another possibility is that Crozier was not in command when the decision was made. The Victory Point note lists Crozier and Fitzjames as signatories, but Fitzjames was senior to Crozier in the expedition hierarchy. If Fitzjames overruled Crozier, the evacuation order would have stood. The lead poisoning may have affected Fitzjames more severely. He may have believed the march was survivable. He may have been wrong. A third possibility is simpler. No one was in command. The officers were as poisoned and confused as the crew. Leadership collapsed. Men made individual choices. Some stayed with the ships. Some marched. Some went in different directions. The skeletal scatter pattern supports this. Bodies point in all directions. No organized column, no unified effort. Just fragmented groups walking to different deaths. The Royal Navy's official inquiry into the disaster, conducted between 1850 and 1854, concluded that environmental factors were responsible. Bad weather, unusually heavy ice, equipment failure. The inquiry mentioned scurvy and starvation. It did not mention lead poisoning. It did not mention the contaminated food supply. It did not mention that the canning contract had been awarded to the lowest bidder without proper quality inspection. Stefan Goldner's company received £83,000 for providing the expedition's food. Goldner subcontracted the work to factories that used untrained workers and minimal quality control. Inspectors later found that many cans were improperly sealed. Some contained spoiled meat before they even left England. But Goldner had political connections. The Admiralty protected him. No charges were filed. No compensation was paid to the families of the dead. Lady Jane Franklin spent her entire fortune funding search expeditions. She petitioned Parliament. She wrote letters to foreign governments. She offered rewards for information. She never accepted that her husband was dead until the Victory Point note was recovered. Even then, she insisted the cannibalism testimony was false. She called it slander against British honour. She died in 1875, still defending her husband's reputation. The Inuit, who told the truth from the beginning, were ignored for decades. Their testimony was dismissed as unreliable. Their offers to guide search parties were refused. When their oral history finally proved accurate, with the discovery of the ships exactly where they said they would be, no apology was issued. No recognition was given. The Franklin expedition became a British tragedy. The Inuit became footnotes. The preserved bodies on Beechey Island, exhumed in 1984, changed everything. Physical evidence could not be dismissed. Forensic analysis could not be ignored. The lead levels were undeniable. The cut marks on bones were undeniable. The truth was undeniable. But even then, some historians argued. Some defended. Some claimed the evidence was misinterpreted. It took 169 years to find the ships. It took 138 years to examine the bodies. It took DNA analysis, forensic anthropology, and underwater archaeology to prove what the Inuit knew in 1854. The crew died from lead poisoning, malnutrition, and desperation. They ate their dead. They died slowly, and no one who could have prevented it was ever held responsible. Here is what we know with certainty. In May 1845, 129 men sailed north with 3 years of provisions and the Royal Navy's most advanced ships. By April 1848, all were dead or dying. 3 men died in the first winter and received proper burials. Sir John Franklin died in June 1847 from unknown causes. 21 more men died before the ships were abandoned. The remaining 105 attempted to march south. None survived. The best explanation is not mysterious. It is mechanical. The expedition failed because of 3 interconnected factors, each preventable, none prevented. First, the food supply was contaminated. Stefan Goldner's company used lead solder to seal the cans. The solder leached into the food. Every meal contained toxins. The crew ingested lead daily for nearly 3 years. Lead poisoning causes neurological damage, confusion, paranoia, impaired judgment. The men were being poisoned from the moment they left England, and no one realized it until their minds began to fail. Second, the technology failed. The steam heating systems were untested in Arctic conditions. The pipes froze, the boilers burst, water flooded the lower decks, the pumps could not keep up. The ships, designed to be unsinkable, became uninhabitable. The crew faced a choice between staying on flooding vessels with failing systems or attempting an overland march. Both options were death sentences. They chose the march because their poisoned minds told them it was survivable. Third, leadership collapsed. Crozier was experienced, but experience means nothing when your brain is saturated with heavy metals. The decision to load sledges with silver plates and toothbrushes instead of survival gear proves the officers were no longer thinking clearly. The decision to march 1,000 miles through Arctic wilderness with no shelter, no depots, and no realistic plan proves command structure had broken down. These were not the actions of rational men. These were the actions of dying men who no longer understood they were dying. The physical evidence supports this conclusion. The cut marks on bones prove cannibalism occurred. The lead levels in preserved tissue prove chronic poisoning. The intact ships on the seafloor prove the vessels were not destroyed by external forces. The scattered skeletal remains prove the march was disorganized and fatal. Every piece of evidence points to the same cause: systemic failure, not bad luck. The consequences were predictable. The Royal Navy conducted an inquiry that blamed weather and ice. The Admiralty protected Stefan Goldner despite evidence of contaminated food. No one was prosecuted. No regulations changed. Lady Jane Franklin defended her husband's honor until her death, refusing to acknowledge the cannibalism evidence even when it became undeniable. The Inuit, who accurately described what happened, were dismissed as unreliable witnesses for decades. The Franklin expedition became legend. Books were written, monuments were erected. Franklin was remembered as a hero who died exploring the unknown. The truth, that he died from eating poisoned food provided by a corrupt contractor, was considered less romantic. The sailors who marched south, who resorted to cannibalism in their final days, were remembered as brave men who perished in service to the crown. The truth, that they were abandoned by a system that prioritized cost savings over safety, was never carved into marble. Beachy Island, where John Torrington and the others were buried, became a historical site. Tourists visit, photographs are taken, the graves are protected. But the men who died later, whose bones were scattered across King William Island, received no markers. Their names are listed on memorial plaques in London, but their bodies remain where they fell. The Arctic took them. The ice preserved some. Animals scattered others. A few were recovered by archaeologists. Most were not. The ships, Erebus and Terror, now rest on the seafloor as underwater heritage sites. Divers are not permitted to enter them. Artifacts are not removed except for scientific study. The Canadian government has declared both wrecks protected. They are crime scenes and graves. The men who died aboard them or abandoned them deserve that much. The preserved bodies changed public understanding of the disaster. Before Owen Beatty's exhumation in 1984, the Franklin expedition was a mystery. After, it became a forensic case study. The lead poisoning theory explained the erratic decisions. The cannibalism evidence explained the Inuit testimony. The intact ships explained why the crew chose to march instead of wait for rescue that would never come. Mystery became science. Speculation became fact. But one question remains unanswered. Not what happened. We know what happened. Not how they died. We know how they died. The question is simpler and harder. The Admiralty knew Goldner's company had failed quality inspections on previous contracts. The Navy knew steam heating systems were experimental and unreliable in extreme cold. Franklin knew the Arctic killed men who made mistakes. The Inuit knew the ice and could have guided rescue parties years earlier. Everyone involved had pieces of information that, combined, predicted disaster. So why did 129 men sail north with poisoned food, untested technology, and no contingency plan for failure, while the system that sent them there faced no accountability when they all died? If everyone knew the risks, why was no one held responsible for their deaths?